a chat I had with a friend of mine who was the editor on the editorial board of the New Yorker magazine, Philip Gurevich, who was introduced to me by Lakshman Kadriga. And John Lee Anderson, who wrote the book on Che Guevara, had done a piece on Sri Lanka which was quite critical, and this was after the war. So I asked Philip at lunch in Paris, I said, why? Because you know the nature of the tigers. Philip himself had written a piece which was anti-tiger before, so I said, what changed? He said, when we started seeing those photographs of the barbed wire and people behind the barbed wire, because it sets off, it's like, former Yugoslavia, Srebrenica and so on. It brings back memories of concentration camp. This was no concentration camp. But when you see old people and kids behind barbed wire with armed guards,
it tends to bring up memories of.
Absolutely. So there were no security concerns that were sufficiently legitimate to outweigh the politico-psychological factor. But that's not the way that we saw it, or at least the dominant elements in the state saw that at that time. So if we had elections in 2009, because as I said, we had local authority
Don't you think, Dr. Jayatilleka, that even if we had elections in 2009, let's say months after the war ended, that the TNA still would have been...
No way. They were reeling. They couldn't be found. The test is August 2009, because there was a municipal election, and Devananda did very well in August 2009. Let me tell you a Putin story, because everybody's talking about Vladimir Putin and how he's outflanked the Americans and,
how he's used diplomacy to trump American aggression.
Putin story. Now, the Sri Lankan authorities boast that Sri Lanka was the first decisive military victory over terrorism in the 21st century, which is of course nonsense. There were two before that. Angola was one, over UNITA, the death of Savimbi. But far more conspicuously, Chechnya, because Putin fought a war and won it. And it wasn't pretty. Grozny was bombed, the capital of Chechnya, into rubble. Is now supposed to be the Paris of the East, of that area, because it's supposed to be beautifully redone. You know what? I've not heard a single criticism of the Russian conduct of the war in the UN Human Rights Council. Nothing about war crimes. I'm not saying there should be, but there isn't anything about war crimes or crimes against humanity. Let's have a probe. Nothing. Not even the Americans. They do criticize Putin. It's not that they don't. They criticize him on Pussy Riot and, Politkovskaya and so on. But nothing about Chechnya. So, why?
But Dr. Jayatilleka, can you draw that comparison between Sri Lanka, an ordinary member of the United Nations, and Russia?
No, but they do criticize Russia.
A permanent member.
They criticize Russia for everything that they possibly can, including the elections. But not on this. Why not? The reason is that 1 year before he won the war, but when the final offensive was going on, Vladimir Putin had an election in Chechnya. And the election was won by a very interesting young man, Ramzan Kadyrov, who was the son of a former warlord and a Chechen separatist, Razlan Kadyrov, who had died and handed power over his militia to his son, Ramzan. Now, Ramzan doesn't have the best human rights record that one can think of. But there's an election and he won the election. Therefore, though there were Russian troops for about 10 years in Chechnya, and they're still around, nobody could say that Russian Orthodox churches were being built in Chechnya where people are Muslim, or that it was Russian colonialism. Why? Because there's a Chechen guy.
They couldn't call them occupying forces.
There was a Chechen administration. Now, Putin is not, liberal, NGO, all the stuff that's, thrown about here in Sri Lanka. But he was smart. We weren't. If that election had been held, maybe not before the war was won, but soon after, the TNA would have been reeling. It was. Devananda would have won, and Colombo would have had its Tamil ally in place. But instead, In Colombo, it was thought that, look, why give any Tamil anything? I mean, let's just give them roads and stuff, which is also militarily helpful. But we don't really have to reactivate this 13th Amendment. Why give even Dayan under that? And they held on, unmindful of the fact that India would eventually twist their arms and you would have to cough up the 13th Amendment, which is what happened.
Which is what is happening.
Which is what is happening. Which is what is happening. But now, the TNA has got back in the game. And there was a second mistake, Nadeem. The government of Sri Lanka was negotiating with the TNA in 2011. I was here in April 2011 at a meeting where the President gave excellent guidelines to his negotiating team. And I remember what he said. He said, okay, I mean, because I was part of the debate that night at Professor Jayatilleka's house. And at the end, the President said, okay, so what we'll do is you tell them that the 13th Amendment is the baseline. All we can negotiate is a concurrent list. Let's work the compromise there. I thought it was superb. And then I went back to Paris. But months later, maybe even weeks later, it broke down. Why did it break down? I mean, I don't know what was happening backstage, but I know what I read in the papers. There were 4 negotiators on the government side. 3 of them had much experience in negotiating the ethnic issue. Nimal Siripala de Silva, Professor G.L. Pires, Professor Rajiva Vijay Singh, former head of the SCOP.
All 3 with solid credentials.
And there was a 4th.
The monitoring MP.
The monitoring MP of the Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Sajin Vas Gunawardena. Now, what he was doing there, I really don't know, but, you know, let's say it was a learning experience. But a couple of weeks later, I read in the newspapers that he, not any of the other 3, had words with Mr. Sambandhan, the senior-most
TNA representative.
And that there had been a blow-up. And then he came out and spoke to the newspapers, the island, and said the TNA is asking for what the Tigers asked for. And that was the end of the negotiations. It's not the TNA that walked out. It's the government of Sri Lanka that didn't go back to the negotiating table and instead insisted that the TNA join the Parliamentary Select Committee, which was a shift of the goalposts. They had not said that before when the talks started. Now, I made the criticism that I have about the TNA in print as well, but the point is that had there been a process of dialogue, the TNA may not have been pushed into the waiting arms of the lobbyists of the Tamil diaspora. Here there was no pull factor by the government of Sri Lanka.
To keep the TNA within ASAM?
No, there was a push factor. If the TNA said, we are willing to talk without preconditions. This is our document. Now, I've read that document. It has some serious issues. I mean, it goes way beyond the 13th Amendment. It wanted all powers over land vested in the Provincial Council. It also wanted foreign investment to be negotiated directly with the Provincial Council. Now, of course, those were problematic. But the government's reaction should not have been to lose its temper and say, we're not going to talk to these guys. Now, the TNA has become part of a pan-Tamil nationalist bloc, which includes the Global Tamil Forum. And this is because of imprudence, strategic imprudence, on the part of the government of Sri Lanka. It has permitted the TNA to be, incorporated by far more seriously secessionist players as part of a strategy of heading for the exit ramp. So it's a very serious situation.
Coming down to the implementation of the 13th Amendment, after the provincial council elections, do you think it's in the best interests of the government to actually implement the 13th Amendment in full in order to prevent themselves from falling into this trap?
Well, Nadeem, there are those who say that the political behavior of the TNA in the campaign shows that the 13th Amendment is dangerous. I don't believe this. We can and must support, for instance, parliamentary democracy, parliament as an institution, while we may be bitterly hostile to any incumbent administration. So these are two different things. I think the 13th Amendment is absolutely necessary, not only for our relations with India, vital strategic relations, but also as a framework for the management of inter-ethnic relations on this island. However, the 13th Amendment must be implemented in full, but perhaps not instantly. You can have a graduated, incremental implementation of the 13th Amendment contingent upon the political behavior of the TNA administration. I mean, if it's all gimme, 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 then obviously the government of Sri Lanka is not going to do that. And frankly, Nadeem, I mean, the election manifesto and the TNA's political behavior distributing pictures of Prabhakaran, TNA activists have been arrested distributing pictures of Prabhakaran, hailing him as a great hero. That is not a case for demilitarization of the North. I mean, it's a case for redeployment of the armed forces, because the armed forces shouldn't be intrusive. But even for somebody like myself, I would like to think of myself as a liberal realist. I wouldn't advocate a drawdown of the armed forces from the North after what's gone on in the last few weeks. So, the 13th Amendment, yes, implementation, graduated, linked to the behavior of the DNA. Do not abolish the 13th Amendment. Do not even dissolve that council. Do not be provoked into dissolving the council, because it's part of a trap. If it comes to a dissolution, let the world see, and let India see, that there was no other option, and that dissolution was not because the Sinhalese could not stand to have an outspoken Tamil chief minister.